Ageism is unique among flavors of discrimination because while biases against gender, race, or sexuality are aimed at certain groups of people, aging plagues us all, eventually. Unfortunately, ageism in the workplace and especially among the hiring practices is still extremely common. Age discrimination is a job search reality. It's not a myth or an urban legend. 2 out of 3 workers between ages 45 and 74 say they have seen or experienced age discrimination at work, and job seekers over 35 cited as the top obstacle to getting hired. In this change proposal, we will be addressing the legal, ethical, and business aspects of ageism in hiring practices. By addressing what ageism is in these practices and what it looks like, it's easier to change the processes or practices that are currently in place. Not only is ageism potentially harmful and illegal, but companies miss out on the benefits of having a diverse workforce, including older employees. Mindful consideration to examine what needs changed, and then good dialogue and collaboration to implement those changes is needed. This change proposal will also address some specific practices and recommendations for immediate change. Also, what other practices and policies could help create long-term change? There are some laws governing age discrimination in the workplace. The Age Discrimination in Employment Act of 1967 protects those 40 years old and older from workplace discrimination. The Act says those 40 and older can't be discriminated against during hiring or firing, as well as other instances. The Act applies to companies with 20 or more workers. This Act is meant to minimize the damaging effects of long-term unemployment on older workers. The Act was amended in 1986 and then again in 1991 with the Older Workers Benefit Protection Act, giving more specific guidelines to anti-discriminatory practices. However, many of the practices are not always obvious, and there is not always legal recourse or accountability for all of these discriminatory practices. These practices are sometimes unconscious. However, there are still ethical issues to examine. Unfortunately, there are hiring managers and recruiters that discriminate intentionally. However, that is the minority. Unconscious bias can lead to talent acquisition professionals, recruiters, or hiring managers to discriminate unintentionally. What does this look like? Maybe it is disregarding a resume with high school or graduation dates that disclose their age. It could be unintentionally discriminatory verbiage in job postings. For example, the phrase "seeking digital natives" was designed to describe younger candidates that grew up in the age of technology, or referring to older candidates as seasoned or highly experienced can also indicate they are older and subconsciously trigger bias. Ageism is illegal and also unethical, but still happens. So what does this look like in actuality in business? Are there changes in the workforce that have impacted these practices? The workforce has changed. The baby boomer generation was the largest generation in the workforce up until recently when the millennials overtook their numbers. However, the baby boomer generation is creating a larger, older workforce than there was before. We have a record number of employees in the workforce still working full-time over the age of 65 as compared to prior generations. And as you can see from the chart above, all of the categories over the age of 45 have increased since 1967. Companies need to adjust to the change of having 4 generations in the workplace at the same time. Having a larger number of employees over the age of 55 than in the past, they need to examine and change any discriminatory practices against those older employees. Up until the COVID-19 pandemic happened, unemployment rates skyrocketed. However, before that, we were at a record low unemployment rate for the first time in 40 years. Organizations not utilizing employees over the age of 65 are missing out on potential talent. So what practices can be reviewed and changed to begin addressing these practices and continue to address ageism in the workforce? Here are some recommendations that could address ageism in the hiring process. Number 1, review job postings for your organization's open positions. Do they contain ageist language? For example, in the requirements, is recent grad or digital native or any variation of that combination posted? Those can be terms specifically posted to attract younger candidates and should be edited. How are the soft skills required listed? There are useful tools online that give examples of discriminatory words and phrases not to use in job postings. This is an immediate action that can be taken. Moving forward, job postings should always be reviewed and edited before they are shared with the general public. The second recommendation would be reviewing the policy and practice regarding resume review. How many and who are reviewing the resumes of potential candidates within your organization? Is there a screening process where multiple people review it, or is it a singular hiring manager that makes a solo decision for either their department or your organization? Changing this process is not an overnight achievement, but establishing the process and reviewing what changes might need to be made is the first step to keeping unconscious bias from invading the resume review process. Once the candidates have been selected for an interview, what is your organization's interview process? Like the resume review, this is not an overnight fix. However, having multiple decision makers' inputs on candidates will help keep those unbiased opinions in check by holding everybody accountable. A good best practice here would be to have multiple interviews with multiple decision makers, group interviews, or panel interviews. Humans have a tendency to like what is similar to themselves, so having a diverse group interview candidates will allow for more diverse feedback and will perpetuate more diversity in the workplace. Because there are so many in the workforce over the age of 40, there is a good chance that the panel or group can be made up of decision makers of different age groups to help eliminate potential age bias. A long-term recommendation would be to consciously and collaboratively review the workforce, the diversity, the different groups, and how your organization maximizes the experience that comes from different candidates. A recommendation to utilize the years of experience that different candidates can bring to a company would be performance and experience-based promotions. Could mentorship or apprenticeships be set up to pair experienced employees with employees that could gain new information and job skills? Years ago, when I worked in manufacturing staffing, manual machinists were growing incredibly difficult to find. The younger machinists were taking CNC training and other more automated or computerized machine classes, and there were not as many manual machinists coming out of school or mentee programs. This was creating a shortage that was only going to get worse as the experienced manual machinists started to retire, leaving a gap in employees with that experience. This is a good example of an industry, actually, not taking advantage of older employees with vast years of experience before they retire and take those years of knowledge with them. To make a change to start eliminating ageism in an organization's hiring process requires a plan. First, the processes and hiring practices need to be reviewed. What is your organization currently doing? After you've observed and reviewed, analyze that information. For example, how many employees over the age of 40 have been hired? For what positions? What is your current interview process? Once the information has been reviewed and analyzed and the changes needed are uncovered, it is then time to make changes to those practices and/or policies. This is going to be a process, and a timeline should be realistically put into place with the immediate changes to any unintentional but illegal practices. Then the new policy should be reviewed for realistic timeframes for implementation. Train new employees coming in on proper hiring processes and ongoing training for employees to help mitigate bad habits and address any issues with the new process before they come up. Hopefully, with the acknowledgement of potentially ageist practices and a long-term plan, an organization can be successful in reducing ageism in its hiring practices. Mindfulness. Mindfulness is extremely important in considering any change within an organization. Within the review process, mindful consideration will be key. An organization that does an honest self-reflection is more apt to make long-term permanent changes. How is dialogue important to any proposed change in an organization? Obviously, good dialogue is the foundation of trust between employees and the company. The different departments and the hiring managers and everybody involved in the hiring process will all need to be able to openly discuss and contribute. Again, good, open, honest dialogue is going to be key to promoting long-term changes. Collaboration is the other leg of the stool that is crucial to long-term change. Hiring managers and decision makers will need to work together. Changes will need to be implemented through good training and employees working together to learn and grow. The potential changes could also create collaborative hiring groups. Is your organization going to begin doing panel interviews? Those are a good example of a collaborative effort within the hiring process. What potential issues or challenges does possibly What possible issues or challenges does change addressing ageism within hiring practices potentially bring? Well, one, there are not a lot of laws governing ageism in the workforce that can be easily enforced or proven. So organizations will need to search their ethical guidelines and do what is right, in many cases something not necessarily governed by a law. Also, discrimination of any kind is not always easy to prove, so employees can develop bad habits of discriminatory practices without even realizing it till it's brought to their attention over time. For example, one bad habit in the hiring process that leads to unconscious bias is spending time on potential candidates' social media pages. Do we see gray hair? Other things that show age? What unconscious bias have we unlocked by looking at their personal life? Change is not always easy for people. So there's another possible challenge will be the resistance to change within an organization, and a company must be prepared for that. Everybody learns differently, so training will need to be multifaceted, which is a process. So within the potential of change, there are several processes that will need to be examined, not just the hiring practice, which is also additional challenges. However, having realistic long-term goals and measurable results is one way to help overcome these potential challenges. The potential impact of making these changes to the hiring practice is going to be less occurrences of ageism within the hiring process, which will lead to a more diverse workforce and a company potentially utilizing the experience of older employees. Studies show that candidates 40 and over are likely to experience ageism in staggering numbers. These practices need to stop. If an organization consciously decides to examine and change these practices, it's going to be an organization that people want to work for. Not only will making these changes keep the company legal, it will make it more desirable and help promote a culture of trust, inclusion, and ethical behavior. In conclusion, ageism exists, and it may never totally disappear. But by reviewing the practices that an organization implements in regards to hiring its candidates, an organization has an opportunity to implement needed change. We are all going to get old, but we have an opportunity to change the attitude and appreciation we will feel.